America built some of the most spectacular vacation resorts the world had ever seen, and then, quietly, it stopped going to them. What's left behind is a graveyard of heart-shaped tubs, empty ballrooms, and overgrown swimming pools that were once the center of everything. These are 15 famous American tourist resorts that are slowly being abandoned. Number 15, Buck Hill Inn, Pocono Mountains, Pennsylvania. The Buck Hill Inn opened in 1901 in the Pocono Mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania, built by Quakers as a temperance retreat, meaning no alcohol, no gambling, just fresh mountain air, golf, and the kind of structured leisure that a certain era of American Protestantism found deeply appropriate. Despite those restraints, or perhaps because of them, it became genuinely popular. For decades, the inn drew guests seeking mountain scenery, formal dining, and what the brochures called the good life away from the city. By the 1980s, the good life had gotten cheaper to find elsewhere. The final years of Buck Hill Inn's operation were defined by thinning margins and deferred maintenance, the twin forces that end most resort stories. The inn closed in the early 1990s, and the massive Tudor-style structure has been sitting in various stages of decay ever since. Attempts to redevelop the property have materialized on paper multiple times and disappeared just as reliably. Today, Buck Hill Inn is a massive ruin in the Pocono Forest, a favorite destination for urban explorers who document the peeling wallpaper, collapsed ceilings, broken skylights, and ballroom floors slowly being reclaimed by moisture and time. The scale of the building makes its deterioration all the more striking. These are not small rooms falling apart. These are grand public spaces, dining halls, ballrooms, wide corridors with high ceilings, doing so at the pace that large, expensive-to-maintain buildings in wet climates tend to deteriorate when nobody is paying the bills. The building is still standing, which is more than can be said for several others on this list. But still standing and surviving are not the same thing. And the gap between those two descriptions has been widening every year since the 1990s. Number 14, Unity House, Poconos, Pennsylvania. Unity House was not a typical resort. It was bought by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in 1924, the ILGWU, one of the most powerful and progressive labor unions in American history, with the explicit intention of giving its members a place to rest, organize, and experience the kind of vacation that had previously been available only to people who owned the factories rather than worked in them. The resort's facilities were remarkable: a 90-foot stage modeled after Radio City Music Hall, a cinema, a lakeside bar, and lectures on art, economics, and current events, alongside the swimming and recreation. Eleanor Roosevelt visited in 1945 and was sufficiently impressed that she praised it publicly as an environment she would be happy to raise children in. John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy both spoke there during various political campaigns. The administrative building on the property housed murals by Diego Rivera, the same Mexican muralist whose work at Rockefeller Center was famously destroyed because of its political content, until that building burned in 1969. Globalization and the weakening of American manufacturing unions through the 1980s and 1990s gradually stripped the ILGWU of both membership and resources. Unity House closed in 2000 as the ILGWU itself merged with other unions, and its membership base shrank along with the American garment industry it had once organized. The buildings have been decaying since, a labor movement monument slowly decomposing in the Pennsylvania hills, a reminder that the institutions built by working people are as vulnerable to history as the industries those workers organized in the first place. Number 13, the Birchwood Resort, Poconos, Pennsylvania. The Birchwood opened in 1953 as a couples resort in the Pocono Mountains, which in the 1950s and 1960s was a perfectly reasonable thing to build. The Poconos had established themselves as the American honeymoon capital, pioneering the aesthetic of heart-shaped everything that later spread to Las Vegas and beyond. Birchwood offered the standard assortment: a bowling alley, a nightclub, a shooting range, and an all-inclusive couples package that kept guests on property from arrival to checkout. In 1969, the resort added its own airstrip. Guests would fly into Allentown and be picked up by a private plane for the final leg, an arrangement that made Birchwood one of the more genuinely exclusive operations in the region. It lasted until business started declining in the 1990s, at which point the management made what is probably the single most counterproductive pivot in Pocono history. They began marketing the resort for sadomasochism and spanking events. The local paper, the Pocono Record, ran advertisements for these events, which generated exactly the kind of publicity that a resort dependent on couples' weekend bookings did not need. The events were canceled. The bookings did not recover. Birchwood closed in 2000 and has been sitting abandoned since, the airstrip gradually disappearing into overgrowth. Number 12, the Pines Hotel, Fallsburg, New York. The Pines Hotel was one of the hotels that made up the Borscht Belt, the network of resorts in New York's Catskill Mountains that became the summer home of Jewish families from New York City from the 1920s through the 1970s. At its height, the Catskills region hosted as many as 500 resorts catering to guests of various incomes. The Pines was on the upper end, a full-scale resort with a golf course, entertainment programming, and the kind of kitchen that operated as though the concept of portion control had never been invented. The Pines closed in 1998, part of the slow-motion collapse of the Borscht Belt that had been underway since cheaper airfare opened Caribbean and European destinations to the middle-class families who had previously spent every summer in Sullivan County. After closing, the main building and surrounding structures deteriorated progressively. In June 2023, the main building was destroyed by fire. The golf course has since been converted into a Jewish religious summer camp, which is at least a form of continuity with the original spirit of the place, even if the building that embodied it no longer exists. Number 11, the Baker Hotel, Mineral Wells, Texas. The Baker Hotel opened in 1929 in Mineral Wells, Texas, a small city about an hour west of Fort Worth that had built its entire identity around the supposed therapeutic properties of its mineral springs. The Baker was designed to be the showcase of that identity, a 14-story, 450-room hotel with a rooftop pool, ballrooms, mineral baths, and a level of luxury that had no obvious business being in a small Texas city, which was precisely the point. Celebrities including Judy Garland, Marlene Dietrich, Will Rogers, and Clark Gable stayed there. The hotel became, briefly, one of the most celebrated resort destinations in the South. When the mineral water craze ended and modern hotel chains arrived, Mineral Wells had little else to offer. The Baker closed in 1972 and spent the next half-century as a towering empty landmark, visible from miles around, slowly deteriorating. Restoration work finally began in the early 2020s, backed by investors who see potential in the building's extraordinary Art Deco architecture and the town's desire for an economic anchor that is not a closing factory or a shuttered chain store. The project has moved slowly and encountered the funding complications that restoration projects of this scale reliably encounter. An old 14-story building that has been sitting empty for 50 years does not give up its problems cheaply. As of the mid-2020s, the Baker's restoration was still in progress, and the hotel had not reopened to guests. Whether it eventually will depends on financing, construction timelines, and the willingness of investors to stay committed through a process that has no shortage of expensive surprises. Mineral Wells has been asking that question, one way or another, since 1972. Number 10, Niagara Falls, New York, the Resort District. Niagara Falls is one of the most magnificent natural spectacles in North America. The American side of the city that shares its name is one of the more striking examples of what happens when a place builds its entire identity around a single attraction and then fails to build anything else around it. At its mid-century peak, Niagara Falls, New York, was a tourist destination with a functioning economy, a population approaching 100,000 people, and a collection of hotels, restaurants, and resort facilities clustered around the falls. The collapse came from multiple directions simultaneously: industrial decline in the 1970s, the Love Canal environmental disaster of 1978 that declared a neighborhood within the city a federal emergency, population loss that cut the city's headcount roughly in half, and the steady loss of tourist dollars to the Canadian side, which invested in infrastructure while the American side did not. Today, 1 in 5 residents lives below the poverty line. 1/5 of the city's housing lots are vacant or in disrepair. The tourism infrastructure, hotels, restaurants, and facilities that once served millions of visitors has been partially abandoned and partially replaced with casino-dependent tourism that benefits a narrow corridor near the falls while leaving the broader city in ongoing distress. A 2012 report from the New York State Comptroller's Office described Niagara Falls as having struggled through decades of population losses, rising crime, and repeated attempts to reinvent itself. In 2025, with Canadian tourist visits to the United States down 38% year-over-year in some months due to cross-border tensions, the situation became meaningfully worse. The falls themselves are still spectacular. Everything built around them on the American side is still working out what comes next. Number 9. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Myrtle Beach draws roughly 20 million visitors a year to its stretch of South Carolina coastline, making it one of the most visited beach destinations in the United States. It has also spent years earning a reputation that its tourism bureau works constantly to counteract. The city earned the unofficial nickname Dirty Myrtle over decades of development that prioritized volume over quality. Budget motels stacked along Ocean Boulevard, a nightlife economy that runs hot in the summer months, and the particular problems that come when a permanent population of about 40,000 people absorbs millions of annual visitors without the infrastructure to manage the combination comfortably. The crime statistics have been the persistent headline. Based on FBI data, Myrtle Beach's violent crime rate in 2023 was more than double the national average, which is how the city acquired a second, darker nickname, Murder Beach, that spread through social media and true crime forums with the speed that unflattering geographic labels tend to travel online. The city disputes the framing. The data is the data. To the city's credit, the numbers have been meaningfully improving. According to Myrtle Beach Police Chief Amy Prock, violent crimes decreased by nearly 47.5% between 2015 and 2024. Downtown revitalization efforts are ongoing. The city has invested in acoustic threat detection technology, expanded community policing, and worked on targeted enforcement in the areas with the worst track records. Progress is real, and the city argues, with some supporting evidence, that the Murder Beach label reflects a reputation that has not kept pace with actual improvements. The problem is that reputations are slow to update, and the physical reality along stretches of Ocean Boulevard, the aging budget motels that have not been renovated in a decade or more, the pawn shops, the late-night corridors that draw the wrong kind of attention in the wrong hours, is not something a press release changes. Myrtle Beach is still one of the most popular beach destinations on the East Coast, which says something real about the quality of what it offers at its best. What it offers at its worst is a reminder that volume and quality are not the same thing, and that 20 million annual visitors are not sufficient, on their own, to maintain a consistent standard across 60 miles of Grand Strand development. Number 8. The Nevele Grande, Ellenville, New York. The Nevele Grande was one of the Catskills resorts that held on longer than most, in part because it kept modernizing. The original property dates to the early 20th century, but its most recognizable form, a futuristic high-rise tower above the rolling Catskill landscape, represented an attempt to reconcile the traditional Borscht Belt experience with mid-century modern ambitions. Guests could ski nearby slopes in winter, skate the indoor rink, see live entertainment, and honeymoon in updated suites that tried to look forward rather than back. The attempt to modernize only delayed the inevitable. By 2009, the Nevele closed after stalled modernization efforts and failed redevelopment proposals. The high-rise tower and surrounding resort facilities have been sitting empty since, a striking silhouette against the Catskills skyline, visible from the highway in a way that forces passing drivers to register the scale of what is no longer operating. The contrast between the building's modernist ambition, glass, geometry, height, and its current state of abandonment is sharper than at most Catskills properties, which at least had the decency to look old when they closed. The Nevele looks like a building that was supposed to outlast everything around it. Proposals for a casino revival and various other redevelopment schemes circulated through the years following closure and never resolved into anything actionable. The building stands as of the mid-2020s, unrenovated, unoccupied, and still oddly impressive from a distance in the way that ambition tends to be, even when it fails. Number 7. The Concord Resort Hotel, Kiamisha Lake, New York. The Concord was, at its peak in the post-war decades, one of the largest resort hotels in the United States. It occupied 1,200 acres in Sullivan County, New York, with 1,500 rooms, a dining room that could seat 3,000 people simultaneously, multiple golf courses, ski lifts, and an entertainment program that brought in performers including Tony Bennett, Jerry Lewis, and virtually every major name in mid-century American entertainment. The resort drew enormous summer crowds from New York City through the 1960s and 1970s. By the 1980s, the same forces that had ended most of the Borscht Belt, cheaper airfare, competition from resort destinations in Florida and the Caribbean, the changing vacation habits of a generation that no longer went where their parents had gone, began affecting even the largest properties. The Concord closed in 1998 after years of declining attendance and financial pressure. Multiple redevelopment attempts came and went. In February 2018, Resorts World Catskills opened on the former Concord site, a hotel and casino with 65,000 square feet of gaming space. The resort is operating, which puts it in a different category from its neighbors. But the resort that replaced it bears essentially no relationship to the institution it displaced, and the surrounding property still contains decaying outbuildings and infrastructure from the Concord era. Number 6. Kutsher's Hotel and Country Club, Monticello, New York. Kutsher's holds a specific place in American cultural history that goes beyond its role as a Catskills resort. Founded in 1907 and developed through the mid-20th century by the Kutsher family, who ran it for 3 generations, it was one of the premier Borscht Belt properties and something more. It was a regular summer destination for NBA players during the era when professional basketball players were not paid enough during the regular season to avoid needing summer work. Wilt Chamberlain worked at Kutsher's in the summer. So did Bill Russell. The camp and the sports programming brought a level of celebrity to the property that went beyond the entertainment headliners it shared with other Catskills resorts. Kutsher's was where basketball happened in the summer, which gave it a specific identity within an industry where identity was the whole product. The hotel closed in 2013, ending 106 years of continuous family operation, a run that stretched from before World War I through the era of smartphones, which is either a remarkable achievement or a reminder of how fast the world moved under the feet of an institution that had been built for a different one. A wellness facility was subsequently constructed on part of the site and opened in 2018, which represents a kind of continuity in the wellness destination sense, but has little connection to what Kutsher's actually was. The original Kutsher's nightclub building is the only structure remaining from the original hotel complex. The hotel's electric sign, the kind of large-format neon sign that said something specific about a particular era of American commercial optimism, was donated to the Sullivan County Historical Museum, a fitting resting place for the end of something that meant a great deal to a particular world that no longer exists in the form it once took. Number 5. Penn Hills Resort, Analamink, Pennsylvania. Penn Hills opened in the Pocono Mountains in the 1940s as a couples resort and became, over the following decades, one of the most successful properties in a region that had built its entire brand on romantic getaways. At its 1960s peak, Penn Hills ran at nearly 80% occupancy year-round, an extraordinary number for a destination resort, with 500 acres of grounds, heart-shaped tubs, mirrored ceilings, circular beds, and the full arsenal of mid-century honeymoon kitsch that the Poconos had pioneered. When cheaper airfare opened Florida, Las Vegas, and eventually international destinations to the same middle-class couples who had previously spent their honeymoons in Pennsylvania, the Poconos' entire honeymoon economy began contracting. Penn Hills held on longer than many competitors. When its owner Genevieve Palladino died in 2009, operations ceased almost immediately, the kind of abrupt ending that happens when a single person's presence is the thing holding a complex operation together. The buildings deteriorated rapidly. Vandals, snowstorms, and Pennsylvania weather worked on the structures until most of them were demolished. The heart-shaped tubs, the centerpiece of the whole enterprise, became the iconic image of Pocono decline, photographs circulating online as a kind of archaeological artifact of a very particular American romantic fantasy. Number 4. Mount Airy Lodge, Mount Pocono, Pennsylvania. Mount Airy Lodge may be the most thoroughly American resort story on this list, not because of its architecture or its guest list, but because of its advertising. The lodge's television commercials from the 1970s and 1980s featuring the tagline, "All you have to bring is your love of everything," over shots of heart-shaped tubs and couples in terry cloth robes, reached a level of earnest romantic sincerity that turned the resort into a cultural reference point. For a generation of American couples, Mount Airy Lodge was not just a place, it was a promise. At its peak, the lodge claimed to welcome over 200,000 guests annually, with nearly 1,200 rooms, themed villas, tennis courts, skiing, and the heart-shaped tubs that the entire Poconos region had made its signature. By the late 1990s, aging infrastructure and maintenance costs that had outpaced revenue for years made the math unsustainable. Mount Airy Lodge closed in 2001. The original structures were eventually demolished, and the property was redeveloped as Mount Airy Casino Resort, which opened in 2007. The casino operates but has no meaningful relationship to the institution that preceded it on the same land. Same address, entirely different story. Number 3. Grossinger's Catskill Resort Hotel, Liberty, New York. Grossinger's was the crown jewel of the Borscht Belt, and, for several decades, one of the most famous resorts in the United States by any reasonable measure. Founded in 1914 by Selig and Malky Grossinger on a Liberty, New York farm, it grew over the following decades into a 1,000-acre complex with an Olympic-size indoor swimming pool, golf courses, ski slopes, a private airstrip, and entertainment that competed directly with Las Vegas in quality and star power. Eddie Fisher performed there. Elizabeth Taylor visited. Milton Berle was a regular. The resort drew more than 150,000 guests in its peak years. Grossinger's was also the inspiration, at least in spirit, for the fictional Kellerman's Resort in the 1987 film Dirty Dancing, a cultural footprint that extends well beyond the property's operating years. The resort closed in 1986, as changing vacation habits made the Catskills model economically unviable for even the most celebrated properties. For a brief period after the closure, there were proposals to convert the property into various alternative uses. None of them moved forward. The buildings sat for decades afterward, slowly deteriorating on the Liberty, New York hillside, becoming landmarks of ruined photography and nostalgic documentary filmmaking. Photographers captured the indoor pool filled with debris, the grand lobby stripped of everything valuable and left to the weather, the pro shop still stocked with merchandise that nobody ever bought. The main complex was partially demolished in 2018, ending a chapter that had been slowly closing for 32 years. A remaining structure on the property was destroyed by fire in August 2022. Plans for a new development on the Grossinger's site, a hotel, residential units, and commercial space, have been announced and revised multiple times. As of the mid-2020s, the project had not fully materialized into construction. What Grossinger's built over 7 decades as a genuine American institution came apart in a fraction of that time. The way things built on a specific cultural moment tend to come apart when that moment passes. Number 2. The Homowack Lodge, Spring Glen, New York. The Homowack was one of the mid-tier Catskills resorts that somehow outlasted many of its more prominent neighbors. It ran as a Borscht Belt property through the era's peak and into its long decline, operating in various forms longer than most. When it finally closed, it was left largely intact, which meant that when photographers and documentarians began exploring abandoned Catskills properties, the Homowack offered something genuinely strange. National Geographic photographer Pablo Iglesias Maurer visited the Homowack and several other abandoned Catskills properties and described an experience that stuck with him more than any other. "The bowling alley," he said in an interview. "I was there on Christmas Day when my family was out of town, and I had nothing to do. I went up there and bowled. It was one of the most surreal moments of my life. It felt like it had been recently lived in. That quality, the sense of a place that had not been so much abandoned as simply paused, is what the photographs of the Homowack communicate. Chairs still at tables, objects left where they were set down. The intact remnants of a social world that ended gradually rather than all at once. The building has continued deteriorating since those photographs were taken, and its future, like most of its neighbors, depends on whether anyone will eventually find the resources and the will to decide what comes next. Number 1. The Borscht Belt as a whole, Catskill Mountains, New York. Picking a single top entry from the dozens of abandoned resorts in New York's Catskill Mountains is not quite the right framework, because what happened there was not the story of one property. It was the story of an entire world that existed for about 5 decades and then came apart in the same amount of time. In their heyday, roughly the 1920s through the late 1960s, the Catskills hosted as many as 500 resorts, catering specifically to Jewish families from New York City, who had been explicitly excluded from most mainstream American resort destinations, whose advertisements in the early 20th century sometimes read, "No Hebrews or consumptives." The Catskills offered an alternative: kosher kitchens, Jewish cultural programming, Yiddish humor, and a summer community that became as much a social institution as a vacation. At the height of the Borscht Belt, it was the launching pad for American comedy. Mel Brooks performed there. Woody Allen performed there. Joan Rivers refined her act in those rooms. Jerry Seinfeld's comedy has roots in the Catskills tradition. The resorts were not just vacation destinations. They were the proving ground for an entire strand of American cultural life. Cheap airfare, assimilation, and the opening of mainstream American resort culture to Jewish guests gradually emptied the Catskills across the 1970s and 1980s. The smaller properties closed first, then the mid-size ones. What remains across Sullivan and Ulster counties is a landscape dotted with abandoned buildings, overgrown swimming pools, and the remnants of a community that was, for a specific time and a specific people, the center of everything. As the Brown University Catskills Institute noted, visitors had simply become bored with the old ways, and cheaper travel let them go farther. The old ways vanished. What replaced them in those beautiful mountain valleys was silence. American resort history is full of places that were the center of everything, right up until they weren't. The forces that empty these places, shifting tastes, cheaper airfare to somewhere more exotic, economic collapse, simple entropy, the death of the one person who held it all together, are not dramatic. They accumulate quietly until one day the lights don't come back on, and by the time most people notice, the season is already over. These 15 resorts were famous enough and beloved enough that people still remember them specifically. Former guests describe them in the kind of detail that suggests the memories are sharp in a way that more generic vacations rarely produce. The Catskills resorts, especially, carried the weight of something that was never only about the swimming pool or the dining room or the entertainment stage. They were about belonging somewhere, about a community that built a world for itself in the mountains of New York and ran it for 50 years before the world moved on. Enough people remember that the empty buildings still have something to say, even as the buildings themselves say less and less each year. If you found this one worth your time, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more American history like this, and not all of it ends with a demolition crew.